Hey folks, Steve here with another World in Flames video. Today we'll be looking at the air mechanics of the game, and this will be another video similar to my last big World in Flames video around the naval mechanics, in that this is going to be a very large video. And so as we go through and touch on different topics, I will make sure to notate the timestamp of that section in the description of the YouTube video. That will be hyperlinked so you can jump to the different topics that you'd like to see covered, so you don't have to watch the entire video at once, or you can come back later and look at different things. If you're viewing this video in the embedded YouTube video on Board Game Geek, where this will be posted, I will put the timestamps in the description there as well. You will have to manually move the sort of progress bar there, but you can also just open it up in YouTube and follow the hyperlinks there if you'd like. So the last video we went through all the naval mechanics in enough detail that I was pretty satisfied with that. And when we did go over some of the aircraft mechanics that kind of exist for naval matters. So we went through some examples of having planes out in sea zones and how they can get there, and the searching that is done for that. We also looked at, very briefly, talking about the need for, if you're playing with the deluxe edition, aircraft carriers actually need planes to be built and basically placed on the aircraft carriers. And so when we get into the air mechanics in this video, I'm going to mostly ignore the naval matter since we already covered that in a previous video. Just know that if you're playing without the deluxe edition counters like Ships in Flames and you're just playing with a regular aircraft carrier, then an aircraft carrier has this value in a colored box on it, like the Ark Royal you can see on the screen here, where those points can be divvied up between tactical factors, fighter factors, and so on. Whereas, again, if you're playing with the deluxe edition, with the swords, swords and flames, swordfish, with the carrier planes and flames stuff, you will need to have separate counters. You'll have to build those planes that all have values on them, very much like all the other aircraft in the game. We did cover that in the last video, so if you want to go take a look into that, you can do so, or just read the rules. You know, it's not too complicated to follow through. So today, in this video, we're going to mostly focus on the land-based air, and because a lot of what we see here impacts the land campaigns that you're going to be conducting, I wanted to make sure to cover this video because there's so much entangled with aircraft when you're conducting ground campaigns that I think it just makes sense to cover this topic first before I do a future video on the ins and outs of land combat and ground warfare and campaigns and all of that stuff. So that's how we're going to do this one. Again, if there's going to be any issues that we run along through this video, I apologize for that. We are using the latest Vassal module. Should be pretty good. And if you have any questions or anything from this video, you can put it in the comment section. I'll try to do what I can to answer there, or, you know, inevitably the best place to go is the Board Game Geek page, where there's a lot of good discussion on the subject. With Wendell will chime in, or I will, and we'll try to help answer questions that could come up. I'm no expert at the game, honestly. I just know enough to be able to teach some of this stuff, and in my in-person game that I'm playing with some friends, I've made some very foolish mistakes as the nation I'm playing at the strategic level, but I at least understand the way the rules work, right? Okay. So I think where we want to go next for the rest of this video is let's just talk about what is the aircraft stats that you have on an aircraft counter. So I've set up sort of a carryover from the last video, a bunch of counters that are set up in sort of a pseudo post-Fall of France setup, but I've mostly just put aircraft here to illustrate the conversation as we go here. So if I zoom in, I think a great example to look at here is just going to be the Sterling bomber, right? It's got a lot of values on the counter, and let's talk about each one in turn. Should be pretty straightforward. This is also on the unit description chart that comes with the game, but this is a good place to start as a baseline. So we'll start with the upper left. So the upper left value on a aircraft counter is going to be their air-to-air factor. So this is going to govern how well they operate and conduct combat against other aircraft. Usually the best units that have this are going to be fighters, which we'll talk to here shortly. The upper right here is the air-to-sea factors, and this is going to govern how well the aircraft performs against naval units. And this will either be, if they are out at sea from a naval air mission, or if they are performing a port strike, which we'll talk about a little bit later in this video. You're going to want to have high air-to-sea factors. Some bombers will have a decent number of this, but the unit that tends to have the best are going to be naval bombers, which we'll talk to here again in a little bit. Then in the bottom right, we have strategic bombing factors. The strategic bombing factors are going to be used for strategic bombing. Probably no surprise there. Your best units for that are going to be these big bombers, typically having large range. Your strategic bombers is what they'll end up being. And those values will be used on a special strategic bombardment roll chart that will govern how much damage or how many production points of damage you inflict upon the opponent when you conduct a bombing mission against factories and whatnot. And then finally, we also have the tactical bombing factors in the lower left. These are going to be the factors that are used to support your ground operations, whether they're doing ground striking or ground support, and there is a difference between those two. Again, we'll cover that a little bit later in the video. The only other thing worth pointing out, at least right now, is the number in the yellow circle. Sometimes that circle is white, and I'll describe why that is a little bit later. But this is going to govern their range in hexes. So, for instance, the Hurricane has a value of 3. So that's 1, 2, 3. It could reach here. It could reach here. It could reach down here as well. So a range of 3. If there is a orange arrow that denotes extended range, and we'll talk a little bit about that later in the video, it just means that they can go farther than that printed number with some penalties in place. So every aircraft unit has these values in some capacity. If there's an asterisk here, it means they lack any value and they essentially can't perform missions that are associated with that value. So for instance, the Hurricane can't do any damage to naval units, for instance. It doesn't have an air-to-sea factor, but it can fight other planes because it has an okay air-to-air factor. It's pretty straightforward stuff there. So next, let's talk about the aircraft unit types. There are broad categories of aircraft units that are organized like the force pools are situated, and they're really evident by the facing of the plane on the unit counter art. So again, I'm going to ignore the aircraft carrier planes because they all kind of are flying to the left there, and they are associated with aircraft carrier stuff. For this one, we just care about for this video where we're focusing on the main land types, we're looking at these pictures, and each denotes a type. So if they're flying to the left, and if you're an expert in World War II planes, you're probably catching on quickly looking at the names of these planes. If they're flying to the left, that means they are fighters, FTRs in the shorthand of the game and force pools. If they're flying upward, or you're sort of seeing them from the top-down view with them going up, then that is a LND bomber, land bomber. If it is flying sort of diagonally down, then that denotes that they are a NAV, N-A-V, a naval bomber. And then finally, if they are, again, you're seeing them from, I believe it's above, but they're flying downwards, then they are ATRs, air transports. And really, each of these kind of has its own role within the game. So fighters are typically going to be used to escort bombers to places to protect them from other fighters. They're going to be looking to shoot enemy bombers down. The bombers, the LND and the NAV bombers, are each going to be used in roles best suited by their overall type. So you will find that there's no distinction typically in the counters in terms of like the picture between a bomber that's really good at strategic bombing and bombers that are much better at ground striking with higher tactical factors versus strategic bombardment. A trend that I see in the counters is that the strategic bombers will tend to have increased costs and longer build times, I think, if I remember correctly, and so they will tend to be in slightly differentiated force pools because of that. But they're all considered LND bombers. And the NAVs, again, they're going to have varying values here, but they're mostly going to be great at attacking naval units. So keep an eye on your LND bombers because, again, their main role is always going to be as bombers when it comes to air combat, which we'll cover shortly. But there's going to be that difference between, very clearly this is going to be, this particular unit here is going to be great for strategic bombing, whereas I'm not sure I have any on the screen here. There might be better units for ground striking than this particular unit here. There might be ones with higher value but lower strategic bombardment, so you're gonna divvy up those units and assign them accordingly based on where they're going to best be used. But obviously everything comes down to what the current state of the game is and what you want to do. Okay, so I think I covered that in okay detail. Probably the only other thing worth noting is that ATRs will tend to have their range number in white. That just kind of helps to note that they are air transports. And their main use is going to be transporting units, right? It seems obvious, running transport missions. Now, depending on what options you're using in the game, there's going to be some variation in who and what is performing air transports. But if you're playing the base game, and for the majority of the time, it is going to be air transports with the white range here that will denote who's doing air transport missions. Okay, so let's talk now about the actual aircraft missions that you can conduct in the game. So there is actually a decent sized list, and I would recommend that if you're following along with this video to look at section 14 of the rules. That's where it talks about aircraft in general, and there is a pretty good chart there that talks about what all the air missions are. Now, what you do for those individual air missions are strewn about in the rules in the relevant sections of the turn order about when you would do them. I think it makes sense here in this video to talk about the sort of, I guess it's like 4 or 5 air missions that will be used the most and most consistently. And those are Combat Air Patrol, or CAP, Escorting, Ground Striking, Ground Support, and Interception. Those are going to be used very often when you play the game, especially the Combat Air, I shouldn't say Combat Air Patrol, but the Escort and Interception is going to be something that is done a lot. And so who can do these different missions is going to depend on the unit type and whether or not they have the actual factors to do it. So let's talk about the first one that will always come up throughout the rules, which is the Combat Air Patrol. Now, Combat Air Patrol is something that is going to be done by your FTRs, your fighters, and it doesn't matter what the air-to-air rating of a bomber is. This can only be done by the sideways flying FTR units. And I guess technically, carrier planes, but we'll not worry about that too much. So a Combat Air Patrol is essentially, before the enemy has done anything, you're using up some of your plane resources to sort of pre-cover an important location. So if it's the German turn, and it gets to a step where they could perform an air mission, they have to allow their opponent, in this case the Commonwealth, to fly cap, is how we would say it, or how I've said it with people. So if the Commonwealth chooses to do so, they will say, I'm going to fly cap with this hurricane, and they'll sort of move it over here. Maybe we can denote this by, I wonder if I can rotate this thing. There we go. So, okay, we're going to fly cap over London. We want to protect London. Now, the Commonwealth players making that distinction, making that choice, in this case, before the Germans have actually allocated any of their bombers. So, it could be that when the German player asks Commonwealth, would you like to fly cap for potential port strikes, for instance, that's fairly early in the turn is when a port strike would occur. They might say, would you like to fly cap? If the Commonwealth player says yes and puts the hurricane here in London to protect London, the German player could very well say, okay, well, I'm not flying any port strike missions this turn. And if that was the case, then the hurricane would come back, would rebase. Maybe it would stay here. Maybe they'd put it back. And then it would have to flip because it's completed a mission, which was flying cap, and now it's done. Now, that means that this airplane's used up, and later in the turn, when the Germans maybe say are going to fly their own strategic bombardment mission, that fighter is not usable. We'd have to use another fighter. It's because of this that I don't think cap is flown very often in the game. It is very situational, I think. I mean, if you have the preponderance of force of fighters that you can put up a wall to protect certain important locations, great. And by doing that, that might show, if you say, okay, well, I'm flying all my cap here, and it's the only target worth attacking, and the Germans decide just to not do it, that might be a good thing. But if they decide to do something else that's also in that area that's worth doing, you might have now less fighters to protect it. So cap is very situational. That combat air patrol, very situational. It's useful to ward off an enemy from taking an action, but you're using up your own resources as the defender to do it. And so I would just be careful when you're playing whether or not you're going to use cap. You typically are not going to do it. Now, the upside of cap is that combat air patrol allows you to use a unit's full range to actually go out. So if I look at, let's see, I'm trying to pick a good example, but any of these guys, like, he can fly cap 3 hexes away, so he could go to Newcastle if he had to with a cap. But by doing that, he would leave these guys far away, but then maybe this guy could fly cap, and so on and so forth. They get their full range value. That's really the main benefit of cap compared to interception, which we'll talk about in a minute here. Actually, let's just talk about interception now. So in the sort of turn order, you would have, cap, are you flying cap? No. And then that attacker is going to decide, well, am I going to fly and attack? Let's reverse the roles here for a second. Say it's the Commonwealth. So if the Commonwealth is going to conduct some mission, they're going to designate, some plane to perform some action over here. And if the Germans don't fly cap because they want to keep their options open, they can instead choose to intercept after the attacker has already designated what planes they're using to come over and take action. So this is kind of why, interception ends up being used more than combat air patrol, because you can see as the defender what the attacker is bringing, and if you actually have a pretty good spread of defending fighters who are going to do the interception, you don't necessarily need to worry about the full range value. When you intercept, you only get half the value. So, for instance, this plane could only intercept in hexes 2 hexes away, not 4. This one could only do hexes that are in its immediate adjacency here. And this one, 3 divided in half rounds up to 2. This would be 2 instead of 3. But because these fighters are fairly well spread out across the way, the Germans are probably okay with not flying any cap and would instead just fly interception and allocate those fighters where they think it would be best to use them. Interception, like combat air patrol, can only be done by FTRs, fighters, and carrier planes. And so there's going to be sort of this need to pick your strategy. Do you want to have, your fighters spread out? Do you want to have them protecting some areas? Like here, you could never properly cap everything here. There's just too many factories. So what you probably do want is a decent number of fighters to be able to come up and respond to bombing campaigns up here. I had, in the in-person game I was playing, the Germans, sneaky, had sent a strategic bomber all the way across the North Sea to bomb Glasgow, and our player who was playing the Commonwealth did not have any fighters up there at all. And none of the planes that would have been down here in the south could actually make it up there to hit. And of course, if you're looking to fly cap, if my German opponent was saying, well, would you like to fly cap? Well, in that game, it wouldn't have mattered. None of these planes probably would have been able to get up to Glasgow, and even if they could, I wouldn't have known that he was choosing to bomb Glasgow. I might have just been thinking, oh, he's going for Sheffield or Hull or Leeds or something like that. I got caught off guard by the range of his plane he had at the time that he was able to get up here. And I think I set up this bomber purely for that example. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. Yeah, we'll talk about that example here when we get to strategic bombardment later in the video. But yeah, so there's cap, interception. Again, cap, very situational. Interception, what you're going to be using pretty much all of the time. So when it comes to actual bombing missions, there is one more role that the fighters will have as part of a bombing mission, which is to fly escort. And all an escort is that when you are choosing to do some other bombing mission, whether it be strategic bombardment, ground striking, ground support, or what have you, your bomber units are going to be performing that action, but you're going to have your accompanying fighters fly escort. And when a fighter is flying escort, they use their full range. And when they perform this, the thing you're going to have to watch out for is like, here's this bomber. If I go on some bombing mission, he has a range of 7, even up to, if he uses his extended range, we could double that to 14 hexes away. Only problem is any escorting fighters aren't going to be able to get very far. And so there's sort of a challenge that you have to figure out on position. And we sort of talked about this in the naval video about an island hopping campaign. So when you're hopping islands, you want to make sure you have fighters and your other planes coming up and basing on these islands that you've now taken control of so they can project power further out. So even in this case in Europe, my bomber can get pretty far. My fighters can't reach as far as the bomber, and so if I could be risky and send this bomber further out, and maybe I could send it so far away that my enemy fighters couldn't intercept it, that might be a good choice. Send it all the way down to Metz or maybe down to Stuttgart if I have the range. And if it's by itself and it doesn't have to worry about intercepting fighters, it's fine. But if I wanted to bomb, say, Cologne, which is right near a fighter that could intercept, if I go by itself, there's a good chance this bomber's going to be shot down. Otherwise, I could maybe bomb Lille, and I could do that because this Spitfire 1, 2, 3 would be in range and could escort. Same thing with this Hurricane 1, 2, 3. It could also get there. So that might be a better option, but then still there are a decent number of enemy fighters here that they could all sort of react into Lille, and it could be a real big hairball of aircraft. And that's the cadence of the game, I guess, when it comes to aircraft and whiff, is that you want your bombers hitting areas with proper fighter escort, and there could be some pretty big battles that come out of that as you play through. Let's see. So we talked about escort, we talked about interception. I think now we can just get into what are the meat and bones of the actual air missions that you would conduct. So let's grab. We'll just grab this HQ unit just as an example. So let's say we wanted to perform a ground strike bombing mission. So ignoring escorting and interception for a second, I just want to hone in on the actual abilities of a bombing aircraft, a land bomber, for instance. So this Sterling and this Beaufighter both have a 3 tactical rating. So if either of these conducted a ground strike, they would be equally as good. And when it comes to a ground strike, basically what is going to happen is you're going to roll a die for each unit in the hex that you're conducting that ground strike against. So you're going to roll a die, and if it is 3 or less, then it will cause the unit that was being rolled for to be flipped. And obviously, it's great to flip HQs because they're really valuable, but even any other normal unit, even aircraft, can be flipped this way. And so it can be very useful to kind of come out of the gate swinging and performing ground strikes against planes. If you're in a surprise move, so in World in Flames there is a surprise mechanic. If you can surprise an enemy, they can't fly cap and they can't intercept on that first impulse. And so you could use a lot of aircraft to do ground strikes and disable their aircraft. That's something that could be valuable to do in a Barbarossa scenario. And so, with this Rundstedt, if we were bombing with this unit here, and in that escorting interception air combat, which we'll cover later in the video, if this bomber managed to clear through to the target, we're going to roll a die for Rundstedt, and if it's a 1, 2, or 3, then he'll flip. And I rolled a 2, so that was successful, so this would flip. Right? It's just that easy. Ground strikes are very simple. Very simple. Sometimes you will want to focus your bombers on one hex to make sure something flips. Other times you may want to spread them out and try to really flip and cause some havoc to the enemy, because flipped units can attack, which can be good to slow down and advance. It can also soften enemies up, because when they're flipped, it provides an attacker who's attacking them bonuses for flipped units. So all around, ground striking enemy forces is going to be a good idea to do. If you're playing with the Divisions in Flames expansion, artillery can also do ground strikes. It's just that airplanes will tend to be more flexible because they can move around the map better. You can change your sort of force composition and where you're applying the most force much easier with planes. Now, if you're doing ground support, ground support's a little bit different, and you do that during the land combat phases. When you get ground support in, if we were having let's just move some units around here. If there was a land combat here with this unit attacking this unit, if you successfully performed ground support, which again, assuming the bombing plane gets past intercepting fighters and the air combat, which is going to happen every time that you have enemy air forces trying to stop your air mission, if this unit gets through, we would get to add the tactical factors to the total attacking combat factors. So this would be a terrible attack in an actual game, a 6 to a 7 attack. But just for point of example, if this bomber was included, it could add 3. It would become a 9 to 7. If both of these bombers got through and were doing ground support missions, they would each add 3, which would make this a 12. to 7. Though one important restriction to keep in mind is that you can't add more factors than what is already there in land combat factors. So if I had, let's just say we had another one of these, so we had 3, 6, 9 factors, we couldn't add them all. I might send all 3 of the bombers in the mission, and maybe 1 gets shot down and 2 get past, but if all 3 got past, and I had 9 air combat factors of ground support, I could still only make use of 6 of them, because 6 is all I have in terms of ground factors there in the combat. It just makes it so that you can't win really weird combats that you would have had no chance of winning otherwise. Like, infinite planes doesn't mean you're going to get guaranteed victory. There's a sort of a cap or a ceiling on how helpful they can be depending on the size of your forces already engaged in combat. Ground strikes and ground supports are going to be pretty common missions for your planes, so you're going to be doing them quite a bit in the course of a game, especially during big offensives. You're going to want to be flipping units, adding support to increase your odds on the combat chart, and all of that good stuff. And so you can imagine what that really means is that there's going to be a lot of airplane activity. There's going to be a lot of escorting. There's going to be a lot of bombing. And if you're playing World in Flames with the oil rules, it's going to mean a lot of oil spent for flying all of these air missions. Now, of course, the activity limits that exist in the game are going to mean that you're not doing, infinite air actions, infinite air missions. But again, there's going to be a lot of points where, as you're conducting combats, there are going to be a lot of these air combats that you have to process and run through. But as we'll get to later in the video and some of these examples, it'll go by pretty quick. You can kind of get through it pretty swiftly, and it's not too bad. Okay, so those are the main air missions, and we'll do some demonstration of some of these later in the video, but just as a roundabout, those are the main ones to look at that you'll encounter. Some of the other ones that we've talked about a little bit already were naval air missions and naval air interceptions. We covered that in a previous video. Basically, naval air mission is sending planes out to a sea zone, and then naval air interception is basically the equivalent of a regular interception, and that a plane that can be on a naval air mission will intercept out to the sea zone to potentially, encounter planes or deal with subs or that sort of thing. The other, some of the other weirder missions. So there is an air resupply mission. This can be performed by ATRs, your air transports, or if you're playing with one of the aircraft options, aircraft ability options, it could be any aircraft with a white range circle. And what an air resupply does is allows you to remotely reorganize a unit even if it doesn't have an HQ nearby. Now, that's getting into some of the game mechanics that I haven't talked to in this video series, like reorganization. Just to cover it briefly, as units are flipped, they can become unflipped and usable again if they're reorganized. At the end of a turn, every unit becomes reorganized because that just resets the whole board. But you can use offensive points with a HQ unit to unflip some units so that they can continue conducting combat operations. An air resupply is basically just like doing a reorganization, except you're doing it with planes. My opponent in my face-to-face game did a brilliant use of this in that we were fighting in China. I was playing the Chinese, he was playing the Japanese. He had managed to make a pretty good gain, but by doing so had a unit that was flipped and out of supply, which meant that I would easily be able to retake it. But before I could make use of that and attack his out-of-supply flipped unit that had taken important ground, he flew an air resupply mission, and that allowed him to unflip his unit, which now had its strength value restored, because an out-of-supply face-down unit has almost no combat factors at all. It gets reduced to 1 in most cases. but by him flipping it back up, even being out of supply, it retained its full combat value, which made it basically impossible for me to successfully reclaim the land that he took. So it was a very good play, and is something, air resupply may not always work in really great situations, but when it does, it can be very critical. And so how that works is that you basically fly a mission like any other mission, and it could be intercepted and so on. You might even need to escort it if it's that important. But you fly a ATR or plane with a white range circle, depending on your option. You fly it to a flipped unit hex, in this case here, and assuming it gets there, you can basically provide a reorganization point to unflip one unit. And again, very situational, maybe in some cases not super valuable, but it can really come in handy, especially because most other times that you're doing reorganization, it is probably going to mean you're expending offensive points, if only because you can reorg by flipping an HQ, and unless you want to wait till the end of the turn for that HQ to come back up, you have to spend O points to flip them again. And so this provides, again, a very narrow possibility of unflipping flipped units, but again, could be very powerful. And if you've got a couple of these, you could keep an offensive going that might have otherwise sort of run out of steam. And so that these could be very important pieces of your strategy if you're going down that route. Now, similarly, there are another use for ATRs that's based on their name, air transport. So this is, again, another thing. Air transport is going to be performed by ATRs or any aircraft with a white range circle if you are playing with that option. And there's really limited ability for air transporting. You have to do it to a friendly hex, so this isn't paradropping. That's a separate kind of mission. And unless you have a large air transport, which I'll cover later in this video, you're really only going to be able to take divisions or trying to think what the other units you can take. It's very limited. You're not going to be, unless you're using a large air transport, you're not going to be transforming core-sized units. So there is some limited ability to make use of them, but the option is there. I'm trying to see if there's any obvious other uses for these guys. Yeah, so an ATR may carry one of a paratrooper unit or a mountain unit. Or if you're playing with divisions in flames, infantry, garrison, or ski division, and if you got a large air transport, then they can take 2 divisions or an infantry corps. So you're not going to be doing this a lot, but it will be valuable in some cases where you can perform it. Now, by comparison, a paradrop mission is going to be where you need to have a paratrooper unit, and let's see if I can just quickly grab one for you. Let's do Commonwealth, and they are, let's see if we've got, yeah, here we go. Bam. So this is a paratrooper para unit, and they need to start on with an ATR in the hex, and then you're going to fly, very much like a transport mission or a ground support mission, fly to some area, fight any other interception combats with escorts, and then they will, land a unit and fly back. And and then these guys will wreak havoc doing whatever they need to do. It's a pretty straightforward mechanic, so nothing too crazy to worry about for that one. Careful of your paratroopers running out of supply, but then if you do some other activities like air resupply, then you might be able to cover yourself okay. And then the final couple of missions worth talking about here, I know this section's getting kind of long, is going to be a port attack. Again, that is essentially an air-to-sea combat die roll with all of your planes attacking some units in a port. You're going to conduct that very much like air-to-sea combat that I covered in the previous naval mechanics video. Just the difference is that port strike is going to be conducted very specifically at a port with planes in it, not at sea. And that can be a very useful way to take out some enemy ships. That's going to be your Pearl Harbor type of attack as a port strike, where if you've brought enough naval bombers, for instance, you have a very strong possibility of sinking enemy ships at that said port. There are rebase missions, and all that really is moving a plane from one area to another area before the rebasing phase or anything like that. And then finally, the strategic bombardment mission, which we'll maybe try to demonstrate here a little bit later, which is going to take one of your planes with a strategic bombardment factor, and you're going to target typically a factory hex to try to remove production points from the opponent and damage facilities potentially, depending on what options you're playing with and that sort of thing. It's going to be pretty important for the Allies to do, and even sometimes the Germans may want to do it to the UK. A lot of possibilities there for that. Before we get into some of those combat examples, I do want to cover very briefly a lot of the different aircraft abilities that exist in the game that can, I guess I'd put it this way, spice the game up a little bit. And some of these are in the base game. Some of them you're going to see more on the planes available in the Planes and Flames expansion. But I grabbed a sampling of the different planes that kind of have this trait, and I'll talk to each of them pretty briefly. I don't want to spend too much time on it because, again, this is an area where, if you're not playing with certain options, it may not always be very relevant, but can be pretty cool to check out and differentiate the forces you have at your disposal. So let's get to it here. So I've got, a nice smattering of units. We'll talk to them very briefly. Again, you can always reference the rule book for all of these, but just as a good roundabout to get through what we're talking about, I wanted to make sure we covered them. So let's start with this guy over here. He's just a good old strategic bomber with that orange arrow. So that is extended range, and it allows the plane to fly double its range value, so 7 becomes 14, if you have the bombing factors for whatever mission you're conducting. So if you're looking to do a strategic bombardment with Halifax that has flown 14 hexes, it won't have 7 strategic bombardment factors. It will have 4. 7 divided in half is 3.5, rounds up to 4 factors instead of 7. So it will be less effective, but you might be able to reach areas that you wouldn't ordinarily be able to reach, and you could reach areas that aren't properly defended by fighters without the fear of it being shot down because you won't have your own escorts. So that can be very valuable. Next, we will look at this plane here, which is an advanced German fighter, a late war unit. This is a 1945 fighter plane. And you can see the air-to-air rating is green. So green air-to-air rating denotes that this is a jet aircraft. And what it allows, if it's a bomber that has a green air-to-air rating, it is a jet. It means it allows the bomber to clear through to its target hex if it survives air combat if the enemy front fighter is not a jet. So this is basically representing, like, if this was a bomber, this particular one's a fighter, but if it were a bomber, if it managed to not be shot down in a air combat round, it simply gets away. And that's because the jets are allowing it to fly that much faster. It can just simply get past the intercepting screen of fighters to get to the target. If you have a fighter that has the green rating and is a jet, that means it can keep enemy jet bombers from getting through. So really, for the fighters having the jet rating, that's best used to defend against an enemy who has jet bombers. And if you happen to have jet bombers and your opponent doesn't have jet fighters, then obviously your jet bombers are going to do a lot more damage. So it's just that escalation of technology. Having it for your bombers is great. Having it for your fighters is only good if you're expecting to deal with jet bombers, because those jet fighters can catch up to the jet bombers, I guess, is sort of the mechanical thinking behind it. Next, we're going to look at this Halifax Mark III plane. It's a little bit different than the Mark II Halifax we were just looking at. This one has a red air-to-sea factor. A red air-to-sea factor denotes that it is a sub-hunter. So this means that this plane is allowed to attempt to intercept subs. So most of the time, a sub is not able to be intercepted because it's, underneath the water, hard to find, whatever. But these sub-hunter planes have the ability to attempt to intercept them. And so they're good for anti-sub warfare, though I don't think there are very many counters that have this sub-hunter ability, and there's going to be some limited use for it, but hey, I think you'd rather like to intercept subs than not intercept subs at all. So where it makes sense, you probably want these guys near your coasts, and then support your other activities to stop them. Obviously, if you have a red number here, it means they have an air-to-sea factor, which means they can conduct naval air missions. So keep that in mind, that they can be used for purposes you might not have originally thought of, and be useful, though this is a great strategic bombardment plane. It's got that extra ability. Next, we're going to go over to this jet fighter plane. This is a variation of the one that we looked at earlier. We're looking at it because it has this red circled tactical factor. So it is something worth pointing out that in World in Flames, fighters can technically act as bombers if need be. So if you treat them as bombers, then they'll be treated as bombers that way in combat, which we'll look at again later in this video. But if they have tactical factors, you can choose to use them as a bomber instead of a fighter to make use of that ability. So there could be an actual bomber plane with a red circle here. It's just that this unit, for the example that I'm showing, it happens to be a fighter, but we would use it as a bomber to make use of this ability. This is a tank buster. So red circle tactical factors equals tank buster. A tank buster ability here provides an additional die roll in ground strikes if the target unit is a mechanized unit, an armored unit, or an armored HQ unit. So 2 dice, that would mean 2 rolls looking for a 3 or less, so that's doubling it. That can be very useful if you're facing an enemy that has used a lot of armored units. Like, if you're able to use these maybe against the Germans, you could slow down a panzer advance. Or if you're dealing with, this being a German unit, you're dealing with some Russians or something, you could try to slow down their armored units with this tank buster by, again, flipping them and reducing their effectiveness. So, again, this is a specialized sort of unit. You could still use its 3 tactical factors by ground striking anything normal. It happens to have the weaponry available that it is very much more effective at hitting those armored units. So, if you have an alternative unit to use against infantry, great, and maybe reserve a unit with this red circled value against areas of the map where you're facing a lot of armor, maybe in the Ukraine or something where there's a lot of flat land to deal with armors, that sort of thing. Next, we'll look at this unit here. It's actually a 2-first. This one has 2 abilities. I'm going to talk about each in turn. One, it's got a black circle for its a black circle around its air-to-air rating. That means it's a night fighter. So if you're playing with the options that allow for different variations of missions, you can have a difference in the altitude of a mission and whether it's a day or night mission. By default, missions are day, but if you are playing with the option and you want to have a night mission, you can do so. Having a black rating up here means that it is a night fighter, which means that when you're uh, you're dealing with a night mission, and your front fighter has that black circled air-to-air rating, um, it doesn't suffer the penalty that is incurred for night missions. Um, I don't want to get too deep into those penalties, but basically it's just that you're going to get one worse combat result if you're not a night fighter, with your fighter conducting operations at night. So this just means this unit is much better at dealing with night combat. Now, if you have an orange air-to-air rating, which this unit also happens to have, it means you're a twin-engine fighter, and that means that you're going to achieve one worse result than normal against non-twin-engined fighters. So it's sort of like a penalty here. So this is a very specialized unit. In most cases, it's not going to perform very well against normal fighters. I mean, it's got a pretty good, damn good rating actually, but it will suffer some penalties if the fighters that it's fighting are single-engine fighters. However, this unit can operate at night better than most other units, so it's sort of a trade-off, a specialized unit, and I'm pretty sure this is a Planes and Flames unit. No, it's not. It's a regular game unit. Interesting. I wonder if... Anyway. So, something to keep in mind, there's some specialty units, I guess, that have very specific purposes. Next, we'll look at this air transport. So when an air transport or a unit has a 0 and then in parentheses in the air-to-air rating, basically that means it's unarmed. And if it is the front bomber and it doesn't have anything, it can't roll dice in air-to-air combat if it's the front bomber and you don't have any other units to protect it. So it essentially just means that it is very vulnerable. That's all that really means. So you're going to want to use it in areas where you definitely have escorts or you're in friendly territory. Next unit here, this Mariner plane, is a flying boat, and that's denoted by the light blue vertical bar on the counter. Basically, all it really is, well, one, it's got damn good range, but that it can only stack in a coastal region, so, in these sort of light blue coast hexes. It has separate stacking from other aircraft, so you could potentially have other aircraft here, and it's like bonus stacking to be in the coastal region. But that's all that really means. So it doesn't seem like it's a really great special ability, but it might help in congested areas where you don't have a lot of stacking ability. And this would go even for, like mountainous coasts. It can still be on the coast fine. Now the unit next to it, this Catalina, it's similar looking, but you can see, and I'll zoom in a little bit so you can see it better, the line is just a little bit different. The blue is a little bit darker, and it looks like there's a bigger border for that color change. So this denotes, that blue-green vertical bar here denotes that it is an amphibious flying boat. And basically it's just like the other flying boat here, except that it can also stack like a regular plane. So this unit has to be on a coast. It can be nowhere else but the coast. This unit can be either a normal plane or it can be a coast plane. And its stacking can be whichever makes sense for you to use it for. So if it's overstacked here for land, other aircraft, then it can be the coast unit, and so on and so forth. So this is marginally better than this, and these two planes, as an example, just both have really great range, which is good. So yeah, they can be useful, I guess. Just very the circumstances will be interesting and where and how you use those guys. Next thing I want to point out is that there's this unit here. It's just a good old naval bomber, but that green bar, horizontal bar going through it, denotes that it is a foreign sourced unit, which means you can only build it if the faction whose that color is representing, which is America, the USA, has provided you, in this case the Commonwealth, India, the unit. So this just means that there's a unit, the Vengeance, that is an American unit. They either have to remove it from their force pool and give it to the Commonwealth, or depending on what option you're playing, deliver said unit to the Commonwealth, and then they can place this unit instead. But that is the only, you can't build it without having done that. So there's a restriction on getting access to this particular unit because of that. And there's a lot of variations of this, so you'll find there are some Chinese units with like an orange bar or vice versa or something, or some Chinese units that have a green bar for American provided units and so on, stuff like that. And then finally, I have on here this unit. This is a air transport, as you can see. It is a large air transport. We know that because it has this sort of infantry corps insignia on here, the NATO symbol. That's just to denote that it is large enough that it can transport a infantry corps like this unit could not. This is one of the regular ADRs that can only take division units or paradrop troops, where this can take an infantry corps. Now, it also has this symbol, which is another ability worth pointing out, which is the may not paradrop symbol, a crossed out parachute. This is used to denote that a transport plane, or whatever plane has this symbol, cannot perform paradrop missions. So while it has a larger transport capacity and it can take more stuff on a regular air transport mission, it can actually not perform paradrop missions. So, that's just, this plane was not used to drop paratroopers. It was a big plane meant to transport a large number of troops. So that is why that is that way. Now, before I move on, there is probably a couple other things worth pointing out. So, like this plane, if we go back to this jet fighter, has this symbol with the sun and the white clouds. That means it's a high altitude plane, and that means that if you were conducting a mission and you chose it to be a high altitude mission, if the fighter has this symbol, it means that it can avoid reducing its air-to-air rating by 1, which occurs if your fighter is going to take part in a high altitude mission but doesn't have that symbol. So basically, just this allows it to avoid a penalty in the more specialized missions that can take place. There's a sort of an opposite symbol that is low altitude, and it's sort of dark cloud symbol. And what that means is that that plane can't do anything at all for high altitude missions. It can't fly escort, it can't intercept, it can't do anything. So a dark cloud symbol is actually really bad, because that means that that plane simply cannot even take part in a high altitude mission. Normal planes can take part in high altitude missions, it's just they suffer some penalties for doing so, unless they have, again, the sun and the white clouds, which I guess just represents that very high altitude setting. And the final one that I ended up not grabbing an example of one. I wonder if I can do it very quickly here. There is, let's see if I can try to find. It is the Death's Head icon, which I just don't know if I'm going to be able to find one in here. I bet not. I'm going to have to look in Planes and Flames. Okay, I'm not going to be able to find an example. So the Death's Head is a black or a sort of gray-white skull, and that's going to denote flying bomb. It's going to be on flying bomb units, and it's going to determine whether the pilot can survive a mission because the flying bombs were meant to be, one and done, and so you just want to watch out for this. It's like a skull and crossbones type of symbol. If it's black, I think it means that the pilot will definitely not survive. Will die every time that unit flies the mission, so you're losing a pilot. Obviously, this comes more into play when you're playing with Planes and Flames with the pilot's option. But it's going to be pretty sparingly that you're even going to see or use it, I think. Okay, so that is all for the aircraft abilities. Now I want to talk about something else to watch out for, which is anti-aircraft. So while we've talked a lot about aircraft units and aircraft missions and everything else, something that plays a part of this is the anti-air units that you're only going to see if you're playing with Divisions and Flames. So it is expansion material. But when you're playing the sort of full monster game, you're going to want to watch out to where these things are located. And it could be easy to miss because you look at it, and I think anti-aircraft is a NATO symbol that's a little less common, so you might not recognize it for what it is. There are really three types. There's regular anti-air, like this unit here. There's light anti-air here. And then there's flak, which is this sort of thing. The picture is not showing up real great in the Vassal module for some reason, but it is a flak cannon. So how this works is that if we just start with regular anti-aircraft, it can fire anti-aircraft in its hex or an adjacent hex. So by being here in Berlin, we're sort of covering each of these hexes around it and Berlin itself. And it has 4 firing actions that can be spread or used in one hex. And what it basically is like you can fire, one here and one here and one here and one here, and each of those is going to use its combat rating of 3. Or you could fire all 4 in Berlin because maybe that's the only target of the bombing mission, and so that all 4 firings of 3, 4 times 3 is 12. You actually have 12 anti-air factors in Berlin firing to protect during some mission, right? This would be occurring during some mission while you're playing out, a ground strike or a strategic bombardment or something. The difference between a regular anti-air and a light anti-air is that light anti-air can't fire at high altitude missions. So if you see this guy who's a light one with no darkened upper circle, for instance, darkened triangle, that might be a good place to fire your high altitude missions or to send your high altitude missions because this guy's not going to be able to do anything about it. This guy could. So it just really depends on, again, that specialization of forces. Where are they at? Trying to find areas where your units are going to be most effective. That's how you would discern that. And then finally, there's flak, which is the same as regular anti-aircraft in almost all ways, except that it's going to have factors against missions that are not strategic bombardment. So it's really best used to protect against what you think will be strategic bombardment. And then I think there's something, I think that's the only difference. I might have to look in the rules if there's any other specifics, but you can do that yourself to make note of, why you might send one versus the other. So this might just be good to have in general. This might be good to have on the front lines, protecting units from ground strikes. And this is going to be, this would be great to have in Berlin because you don't want, it's nice to have the flexibility of this unit, but this is also great because it's got higher factors, and you really want to make sure that you protect Berlin from strategic bombardment, for instance. Just as, where and how would you use these units? Or, like this might be good over here, because then it can also cover these hexes if it has to, that sort of thing. All workable. So, if you're just playing the base game, these aren't going to be here. It's going to be a little bit easier to find some good places to launch attacks depending on where the enemy fighters are. These are just, again, another added protection that will be available to you if you're playing the deluxe game. Okay, so now let's talk about an actual aircraft battle example. Now, I don't want this to be too, I guess, crazy involved, but let's just see how it goes, right? So let's see. I want to get this set up. I think what we'll do. I want to find something that will be a good example, but I think. Okay. I think with our strategic strategic bomber in London, that this might be a good example to play through just over here on the coast. And let's do this, a strategic bombardment. So if you'd like to follow along in the rules, we're going to be looking at section 11.7, and we're just going to run through the turn order there as best that we can. And I'll try to keep it relatively simple, because I think from here on out, you want to leverage everything we've talked about in this video in your own games where things could be more complicated. I just want to run through this as an okay example. I have a similar example of play in my Fatal Alliance video for aircraft and air missions. So if you want more examples, you can watch that video. It isn't World in Flames, it's Fatal Alliances, but it's awfully close. Only difference being, it's a World War I game, so you really don't have a ton of aircraft, and they're not amazing aircraft anyway, because it's just World War I. That's not how they use planes, same way. But we'll go through this. So first, if we were at 11.7 on the turn order for strategic bombardment, the Commonwealth player is going to let the German player fly combat air patrol to potential target hexes. So if I'm the German player for a second, and let's just say, this is all what's going on, I'm going to look and say, okay, well, I know he's going to do a strategic bombardment. His only strategic bomber that I can see is the Sterling, and it can conduct a extended range bombing mission 14 hexes away. So how far could that even possibly be? So let's just look. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. And if I just sort of swing out this way with it, oof. Yeah, I can hit a lot of areas, a lot of potential areas. But with all of the fighters that we have out here available, I am not too terribly concerned about cap. So the German player would say, I am not flying combat air patrol. Now, the Commonwealth player has to decide who's flying as bombers and what escorting fighters are going to go to the hexes. And if they were playing with the right option, they'd also be announcing what altitude and time of day. I'm going to keep this simple and just say it's normal altitude, day mission. No reason to get any more complicated than that here. Now, I do want my plane to be... I do want this to be a safe... I want to protect this bomber, because the bomber is pretty expensive. So this will be the bomber, and it will fly to Lille. We're going to target Lille for this. Gonna move this guy over to the left, right, real quick. So he's going. I also want to send this as an escorting fighter. I'll also send this as an escorting fighter. And let's see. The nav can't fly an escort because it is not a fighter. I believe that they will need to be if I want to do an escort. And it's funny, I know I just talked about these rules, but I want to make sure I got it right for this example. Sort of the, navs are going to be great bombers, but they're typically not going to, they're simply not fighter aircraft. Yeah, they're not a FTR. This is an NAV. So don't be confused by it flying to the left. It's flying at a diagonal, which means it's a nav. So this is the best that I can do right now. So now that I've designated who my bombers are and who my escorting fighters are, now the Germans get to fly their intercepting fighters to the target hexes. So this guy can go half of 3, which is in this case 2 due to rounding. He can't get there. These guys can't get there. This guy was already in the hex, so he's simply going to just fly interception into the hex. This is within range, so he's going to fly interception to the hex. This guy can't quite get there. Now, here's the interesting thing. Now that the opponent has flown intercepting fighters, the Commonwealth now can fly intercepting fighters as well. And so maybe as a different example, maybe we had it say, this is going to be my bomber, and I'm not going to designate any escorting units. And so the German player says, well, I'm going to pounce on it, and then, oh, well, I guess they don't have the range. Never mind. Okay, so these guys were the escorting using their full value. These guys use half value and intercept. If I had another friendly plane, let's say over here, then they could intercept with half of their range and join the fight as well. So that's the sort of cadence. It's sort of, your opponent gets a chance to fly cap with full range, then you fly your guys with full range, then they intercept with any guys they can at half range, and then you fly any intercepting guys with half range. A lot of the time, if you're making these leaps across enemy lines, you're not going to have these extra fighters that can just intercept as well. But it's providing you that capability of saying, well, they brought more than I thought they were going to bring. Any local forces that I have can also join the fray. And you can sort of see how it can end up being like, I bring a lot of forces, they bring a lot of forces, then I bring even more forces. And so this whole region ends up becoming embroiled in just this one bombing mission, and a lot of planes are going to end up flipped at the end of the combat because of that. Okay, so now that we've done that, we are going to fight our air-to-air combat. And I guess I'm just real quick, I'm just going to grab this guy and I'm going to set him right there for later in the example, just to be complete here. Okay, so let's fight our air battle. So for this, we can, if we want to, because we're in the vassal module, we can use the air-to-air mat. So I'm going to pop this sucker open. And so now we're going to align our aircraft like so. So the Germans don't have any bombers here, so they're going to simply line up their fighters like so. And the way that you typically want this, as advised, I think in the rules they mentioned this, you want your best fighter as your front fighter, and you want your best bomber as your last bomber. In this example, it doesn't really matter, but it just, for the bomber's sake, the last bomber is going to be the one most likely to basically not been touched by the air combat, so that if all the enemy fighters and bombers and stuff have been aborted, that last bomber is going to be able to fly by and get to the opponent's hex. So we're going to set our Hurricane behind our Spitfire, and we're going to put our Sterling here as our front bomber. And so this is how we would set it up, like so. So air combat is fought in a series of rounds, so if you're wanting to follow along in the rules, it's going to be page, I think it's 64 of the PDF that I'm looking at, but it's rules section 14.3.2. So first thing that we're going to do is we're going to get our combat values for the die rolls. So your air combat value for each round is your air-to-air strength minus your opponent's air-to-air strength. So typically, one side will have a positive value, one side will have a negative value unless it's tied. So we're going to calculate it for the start of the round. So it's going to be equal to the air-to-air rating of our front fighter, plus 1/10 the air-to-air rating of each other fighter, which, you know, is going to end up rounding a pretty good bit here. So if I did that, it's going to be 5 plus 1/10 of 4. 1/10 of 4 is basically negligible, and so I think it rounds down to just 5. The Germans similarly are at 6 plus 1/10 of the air rating of each other fighter. 1/10 of 5 is not even worth dealing with. Well, actually, I don't know about that. I need to think about that for a second. Yeah, 1/10 of 5 is 0.5. So 6.5 actually rounds up to 7. Yeah. I think that it would be what the case is here. So it's actually 5 to 7. So the Germans have the edge here, I think. Yeah, okay. So then it's going to be, and I'm just going to make note here, 5 CW to 7 German. Which maybe this wasn't such a good idea, but we'll see what happens. All right, so now we're gonna consult the air combat table. I'm just gonna grab the air combat chart here, like so. It's gonna get a very busy screen here for a minute, but stick with me. All right, so here's the air combat. This is really where we're caring about most. So first, the inactive side, meaning the Germans, are gonna roll 2 dice and add them together, and then we're gonna cross-reference that with our value. So the Germans are up by 2, so they're gonna be on this +2, 3 column. And we'll roll our 2 dice. Only a 5. 5, cross-reference here is AX, which is attacker, meaning the dice roller here, destroys defender's front, fighter, or bomber. Well, that is definitely good for the Germans. So I think they're going to... Yeah, attacker destroys defender's front bomber, front fighter, or bomber. So we would destroy this plane. So I'll just throw it over here. It was destroyed, and now we will have the Commonwealth roll. So they're going to roll 2 dice. They rolled a 6. A 6 on the -2 is DA, which means the defender aborts own front fighter or bomber, so they're going to abort him. And then the active side can voluntarily abort the air-to-air combat. Well, I mean, they could maybe want to stick around to shoot at more German planes if they can knock this guy out because they'll have an advantage, or it's going to be even in the next combat round. But I think this is where they would both want to abort. Now, had the Germans decided to abort and this plane was still up and not aborted or destroyed, then, you know, basically the Germans retreat, and that allows the Commonwealth to fire the mission. Okay, so this example kind of went really strong in the Germans' favor. They were able to destroy the bomber, and everything else sort of went fine for them after that. But for the sake of the example, let's say, you know, this guy got aborted because he was in front, but when the Germans rolled, let's see, they were on the +2. Let's pretend like they rolled an 11. Which is defender clears through any one bomber. Okay, so they clear through the bomber, and everything else about this situation doesn't matter. Yeah, let's just do that for now, for the sake of the example. But you can see, you know, based on what you roll, you could end up, you know, the opponent might get to pick something that clears through, or they might get to pick one of your units to be destroyed, or sometimes you get to pick which of your units is aborted or destroyed. It just depends on where you end up on the die roll. I think in this particular one, rolling, I think you want to roll, gosh, it's a non-linear table, so I can't tell you that you want to roll high or low on here, but, you know, roll and hope for the best, I guess. Obviously, having a higher combat value rating is going to be better for you overall compared to the opposite. You can sort of see a trend here that it's like AX is good for you, so it's, I guess you want to roll on the edges, or the you know, several standard deviations out, but if you roll average, the average rolls aren't going to be good, I guess, is what it seems like. It's kind of, you know, when you're looking to interpret this, I'm going to be staring at this graph like crazy for a while now that I'm just like looking at the patterns of the results. Anyway, so let's say for our example that the bomber actually did get cleared through. The rest of the fighters, it doesn't really matter what will happen with the rest of the fighters. They're basically going to have aborted, basically, and, you know, when they abort like that, they're basically just going to go back somewhere and pop a squat. So we'll send these guys wherever they're going to be flipped by the end of this. I'm mostly just moving them to get rid of them. Okay, let's do that. Okay, so our bomber managed to clear through to Lille. But now, surviving bombers are going to suffer anti-aircraft fire from AA and Flak. And we're going to have this anti-aircraft fire AA into this hex, all 4 of its firings. So we're going to take 4 times 3 is 12, I believe, is how we would do that. And I just want to make sure. Sorry, guys. Just want to make sure I follow this through with the best thing I got here. Okay. So again, I'm going to look at section 22.2 of the rules, just talking about anti-aircraft units. Can shoot at enemy aircraft flying a mission to a unit's hex or an adjacent hex. Each A may fire up to 4 times a step. It may fire 4 times at one hex, 3 times at one hex, and once at another. If you fire twice at a hex, double the AA factors, blah, 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 blah. resolve anti-aircraft fire after air-to-air combat and before cleared-through bombers attack their hex. Resolve anti-aircraft fire against the cleared-through bombers only, exactly like naval anti-aircraft fire, reducing tactical, strategic, or air-to-air factors as appropriate. So it's going to mean that this unit is face down after the end of this phase. That's fine. And so let's do, now we're going to look at 11.59, where we do anti-aircraft fire, just like we did in the naval mechanic video that I did in the last video. Yeah. Okay, so that means we need to look at our naval combat chart. Anti-air. So we have, if I just flip this guy again, 3 times 4 is 12. So we have 12 anti-air. So we're going to be on this chart here. Oops. Number of enemy bombers is 1. So we're going to be rolling 4 dice. And we're going to count the lowest of the 4 dice. So let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4. Unfortunately, the lowest is a 2. Okay, so with the 2 points, which is not very much, for every 1 remaining point in the total, 1 further air-to-sea factor does not press the attack. In this case, we're not using air-to-sea, we're using strategic bombardment factors, but I think in this case, we're going to have those 2 points. We're going to have that affect the actual bombing factors here. So, yeah, I think this is going to take 2 off of the 7 bombardment factors. So that means we're going to have 5 strategic bombardment factors. It wasn't enough to abort the plane unit. It wasn't enough to destroy it. But what we have done is, these counters represent more than just one plane, obviously. It's a whole series of planes, or sets of planes, that are working together, with the predominant model being the one on the counter. So in this situation, the anti-aircraft guns have been able to fend off some of the planes that couldn't quite make the bombing mission, but there's enough here that we're still going to get some of these results here. So much for that. So we're going to now look at the surviving bombers attack the target hexes. And so now we're going to look at the air combat charts again, only this time we're going to look at the strategic bombardment. And so we have 5 factors. So had we not been shot by anti-air, we would have been on the 7 to 9 chart. Instead, we're on the 4 to 6. And now we're going to roll a die. And we'll see what we get. and I rolled a 5. A 5. Oh, well, look at that. Nothing. So this is kind of important. So, had we rolled a 1 and the anti-aircraft, or had we rolled a 5 and the anti-aircraft not aborted some of those bombardment factors, they would have scored a hit, and the Germans would have lost a production point for the turn. But instead, because of that anti-aircraft reducing the factors, they didn't get anything. So this is a failed bombing mission. A lot of grief for nothing for the Commonwealth, I guess. But when it comes to strategic bombardment, basically, what you score here on the results, assuming you're bombing a factory hex, is going to be the number of production points that will be lost from the factory owner's production point total for the turn. And if, depending on what else you're playing with territories in flames or whatever, you might also be able to destroy factories or oil reserves if you manage to get these really good results with the asterisks here. But obviously you would need to roll well and also have quite a bit of bombardment factors, so probably multiple of these bombers probably being supported by the Americans, who knows, to be able to do lots and lots of damage. So, yeah, interesting stuff there for you to consider. Let me see if there's anything else worth calling out here. I mean, I think we covered most of the action here, right? We talked about the different aircraft types. We've talked about how they're used. We've talked about the different aircraft special abilities that are going to come into play depending on what expansions or options you're choosing to use. I do think the options that come in on the different planes, like the jet abilities and high altitude night missions, I think all of those are really interesting adds to the game, and they make it a little more interesting than just, hey, I'm going to roll a die. If you're playing with all the expansions and the deluxe counters and stuff, it just adds a lot more strategic thinking to it. So, had this been the fighter that could intercept, I might have chosen high altitude because this guy simply was never going to get there. Because he's got that dark cloud low altitude restriction. He can't go to high altitude missions. Where I put these anti-aircraft units are going to be important. Do I want to risk bombing an area that's heavily protected by AA and fighters? There's a lot here that I think that you could look at applying to the game. Even the classic game will be fine if you're not playing with any of these things and you're just playing straight up with planes. It'll be interesting. That sort of, bidding your planes to see where you're going to allocate forces. But, I think all the additional stuff just adds a lot of depth to it. You'll see if you look at the sequence of play that there are, a lot of things that are done in a specific order. So if you use all your planes for a port strike, they won't be able to help do other things later. Or if you waste a lot of your escorts for a strategic bombardment, those same fighters aren't going to be useful to escort ground strikes or ground support actions you have on the ground. And so you'll need to kind of pace yourself and where you want to use your airplane assets. The only other thing I probably should point out is if you're playing with Planes and Flames and you're choosing to play with pilots, just know that the build cost of planes are supposed to be cheaper if you're playing with pilots. And I mean, a lot of that just comes down to, if I can find the right quote here for you, within the section of the rules that governs it. I mean, it makes planes cheaper because when you're building a plane counter, you're building the planes, and you need to train the pilots separately, which costs, so many production points and their own time to train. If you're not playing with pilots, then you're paying the value that's on the counter for, in this case, for this unit, and it's assumed that the pilots are a part of the counter, right? But if you're playing with the option for pilots, it basically just means that you're increasing the granularity of what you're tracking, and so the planes themselves will be cheaper, but you have to separately build pilots. And the reason why that's actually useful and cool is that on the air combat chart, you have these colors on the chart, and it's going to govern whether your pilot survives or dies. So it could very well mean, if you're up in this region of your combat results, you may have a plane destroyed, but if the pilot survives, you only have to spend the production and time to build a new aircraft unit that the pilot can then use to get it back on the board as a useful unit. Whereas if you're not playing with pilots, anything that's shot down is just shot down, and you've absorbed all of the cost of it. But with pilots, you sort of get this savings in terms of production and time, because maybe you even have, maybe your bottleneck of production is that you don't have a lot of pilots, but you have a lot of extra planes. Well, if a plane gets shot down and you already have an aircraft built in reserve, and that's where they're at. If you build a plane and you don't have a pilot for it, it simply goes into your reserve pool. When you have an available pilot, you can then place that aircraft at the beginning of your turn, or the beginning of your impulse. And so you're going to want to put those pilots to work, and maybe you can retire out of date planes that are crappy, put the pilot, pull the pilot out and put them in a brand new plane, and you're not having to pay that full value for everything. So again, it's just a granularity thing, and it just makes that air combat a little more scary when you have that possibility of your pilot dying. Now it's more dramatic. Now you've got to retrain the pilots, and that really sucks. In the whole thing. So it's just that added layer, again, like with all the options and expansions for World in Flames, it's just modifying the granularity and realism of the game to whatever degree you feel comfortable with. Yeah, so should be great, should be good stuff. Have fun with it, guys. Hope you enjoyed this video. I know it's run long, but again, the bookmarks should all be there in the YouTube description, so you should be able to hop in and around all the different topics. Hopefully this has been very helpful, and you understand the importance of using your aircraft, where they're best used, and all the different capabilities you have at your disposal in the game. We'll probably see more examples of this when I cover some of the ground campaign mechanics, though I'll try to stick with that being mostly for all the land stuff that we have not yet covered in this video series. So I think we'll leave it at that. If you'd like to see more videos like this, hit the subscribe button. If you like the video, hit like, that whole thing for YouTube as it is. We'll look to do some more World in Flames videos here in the new year of 2019. I will maybe try to get one more video out before the end of the year, but it's time to be merry and nice and all that good stuff, and we'll see how motivated I am. So thanks for watching again, and we'll catch you next time. Take care. Have a good one.